With Antifa in the spotlight again, what is the longer-term significance of the recent brutal attacks on journalist Andy Ngo? What is Antifa exactly, and what are its historical origins? How has media coverage of Antifa influenced its behavior today? And how do anti-masking laws fit into the picture? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Today we sit down with Jack Posobiec, a One America News Network host, who was once a U.S. military intelligence officer and later acted as Special Projects Director for Citizens for Trump. He is author of 4D Warfare, a doctrine for a new generation of politics. Jack Posobiec, wonderful to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Jan, thank you so much for finally having me on here.
So let's talk about Antifa. You've actually been assaulted by Antifa. You have exposed Antifa. You've led to Twitter banning Antifa accounts. You've written extensively. You've compared Antifa to the Red Guard in your book, 4D Warfare. Why don't you break down Antifa for us?
They are the street forces that are pushing the front line of communism, not through dialogue, not through learning, not through facts, not through persuasion. They are the militant wing of communism. And Antifa in the US, as we see them today, they've gained a lot of notoriety and a lot of popularity. What a lot of people don't understand is that there's a historical basis to what Antifa is doing. This has been part of a toxic ideology that we've seen go across the world. It really encompassed the world from the Soviet Union to the Spanish Civil War to, of course, China and the Chinese Communist Revolution to Cuba, many others. So there's always, when we see one of these communist revolutions, there's always a preceding sort of leading edge of and it's typically youth. It's very much typically a group that's encompassed of youth that's pushing in the streets, that's pushing violence in order to achieve the ends of the political leaders and the organizations that are above them that are pushing for radical change in a system. So when we see the Antifa groups of today, we have to know that Antifa existed long before Donald Trump existed. Antifa existed in Europe for many, many years, and Antifa goes back all the way even to pre-war Germany. We saw this was funded by the Soviet Union. It was Trotsky basically said Antifa is going to be the militant arm, the international arm of communism. This was set up by the Soviet Union to push and foment for communism in other countries during that sort of pre-war time. And we see this throughout history. We saw China in a very interesting way. Of course, they had the Communist Revolution, and then about 10, 15 years into it, they had another revolution inside of the first revolution called the Cultural Revolution, which saw the rise of the Red Guards again, which is essentially another version of China's version of Antifa, because essentially Mao thought that he was losing his grip on the party, he was losing his grip on the society, so he decided to really reinforce that and just unleashed violence and terror campaigns for almost like a complete decade inside of China.
Why is it that we seem to be seeing Antifa becoming active only after, let's say, 2015? I don't know if that's exactly accurate, but it's certainly, they only really came into my consciousness after about 2015.
Oh, for the United States?
Yes, for the United States.
So
exactly.
Because Antifa had not really been embraced in the West, specifically in the United States, they weren't possibly as notorious as they should have been. But if you can look throughout history and see them across Europe, you can see them even in the 2010s. There's a little bit of an Antifa presence within the US. I would say the Occupy movement is really the start of Antifa, so 2011, 2012. And then as they grew, the more of the social justice movement kind of followed along through academia, through pop culture. We're seeing it now in corporate America is pushing social justice culture, and that's fed into Antifa. That's fed into the rise of Antifa. We see this hand in hand with the rise of the DSA. That's the Democrat Socialists of America, which is, sort of more the quasi-political wing of this militant left, whereas Antifa is just the straight militant wing. And this new push for socialism in America by a new name. And it's all socialism with just different marketing. And so while Antifa is growing, this is the same groups. Other times people would call them, they would call themselves RevCom. In other chances they would call themselves Occupy. Now they're going by Antifa, but of course they never officially refer to themselves as Antifa. Each chapter will sort of use a different name, a different sort of front group. So in the San Francisco, Berkeley area, they're referred to as By All Means Necessary, or BAM. In Washington, D.C., they've called themselves Smash Racism D.C. They're now going by All Out D.C. But it's essentially the same district, and we see the same tactics being used again and again in these different areas. So we know that it is a central focus in terms of the ideology, a central focus in terms of the tactics that they're using. And then, of course, we see books like Mark Bray, who is, a pro-violence, a pro-violence public intellectual, coming out and writing this book called The Anti-Fascist Handbook, which justifies the sort of violence that they're doing. So they know what they're doing, and they're just very clever about it, in many cases very sophisticated as well.
It's interesting that you mentioned Bray. There was an article in Quillette, which I'm sure you looked at, which basically looks at how there's certain journalists out there in the mainstream and not mainstream media that all seem to be egging on the Antifa, or at least are supportive of it, or are downplaying its violence and so forth. What do you make of this trend? That seems to be like a new thing.
Yeah, we saw this in the Middle East as well, with certain journalists who would be very supportive of Al-Qaeda. We saw journalists who would sort of embed with the Al-Qaeda organization and try to bring forward their perspective and their side of things, their worldview. But essentially, we all knew inherently that what these journalists were doing was not journalism, it was propaganda. It was PR releases for these organizations in order to try to find ways to justify their violence and justify their violent means. Mark Bray has this line essentially where, I'm paraphrasing of course, but he talks about how it's, well, if they are fighting intolerance, then any means you use to fight intolerance is therefore justified, because intolerance leads to fascism, and fascism is evil, so in order to fight it, you must be able to use whatever tactics you want to use, which of course is why we see violence being conducted against people who, now of course, what's the definition of intolerance? Who defines what that is? Is that, a guy like Andy Ngo walking down the street and live streaming, a guy like Jack Posobiec walking down the street and live streaming? No, that's not intolerance, that's live streaming. That's documenting what's going on. So for them to use violence, though, they have to play these sort of word games, these sort of mind games on themselves in order to justify these violent impulses. And it's really sort of a very low instinctual driver that's pushing them forward, that's pushing this violence forward. And a lot of members of Antifa, sort of former members that have come forward, they'll tell you straight up that, look, we went into this thing because we wanted to fight. Look, I was in the military, I was in the Navy. I knew guys who used to like to go out and have a few drinks, pound a few, and they would go look for fights, right? They would go out to the bar and, we're going to pick a fight tonight. Don't know who it's going to be, don't know where it's going to be. Not me, of course, I'm well known for my sobriety, but we would know guys like that. So there's an element within Antifa that's also sort of just looking to pick a fight, and there's organizers, this is the difference, there's organizers within Antifa that are utilizing it as a tool, and then there's people like Bray, and there's people like these journalists and these bloggers who are going out there and providing air cover for it to try to justify, CNN as a great example, right? They said, seeking peace through violence. I mean, this is like straight out of George Orwell, right? Peace through violence. Chris Cuomo at CNN comparing Antifa to the soldiers at Normandy, storming the beaches of France, Nazi Germany controlled France, and comparing these street thugs and these kids who are beating up, in some cases, elderly people, in other cases, journalists like Andy, and comparing them. I mean, it's a complete joke. It's absolutely a complete joke. But to understand that this air cover, this sort of psychological manipulation is not meant for people outside of the group. It's meant for inside the group very much, in order to justify them to continue what they are doing, right? It allows them sort of the mental justification, the emotional justification to continue their violence because they're told that their violence is correct, because they're fighting against fascism, they're fighting against intolerance. Therefore, their fight is a righteous fight. Chris Cuomo has a monologue that he's never disavowed, that he's never said he disagrees with, that says, not all punches are equal. That's CNN, right? One of their lead hosts saying not all punches are equal, that it's okay to punch people that have different political views than you. Now, I'm of the mind that I'm a peaceful guy. I call myself the leader of the New Peace Movement. We cannot have political violence of any stripe, because when you start to agree and decide that political violence is justified, that sends you down a very dark spiral and a very deep situation that gets out of control very quickly. Because when one side decides that violence is okay, inevitably there will be an element of reaction to that. And that is going to spin things way out of control. So that's why myself personally, I've stood against all violence, regardless of what side it is, red, blue, black, green, you know, any of these movements. You have to say that we're going to use our words, we're going to use our ideas, you know, we're going to use tweets, but we're not going to use fists, we're not going to use weapons of destruction, we're not going to use tools of violence to attack each other, because when that starts, it is very hard to be able to stop that. And I've stood against violence regardless of where it stands on the spectrum. And now you've got these media groups that are providing them air cover, and they're also sending out a propaganda campaign against those political opponents in order to get the public at large to start to think that, you know what, maybe it is okay to be intolerant to someone in a red hat supporting President Trump, a red MAGA hat, because, well, this article says that those people are intolerant. This article says that those people are bad, right? And this is the essential difference, that instead of my political opponent just having a difference of opinion with me, it's that my political opponent is bad. Right. And that I must therefore have a reaction to stop the bad thing, rather than say, look, you voted for a different guy for president than me, and they won and we lost, and better luck next time, which is kind of how it used to be in politics. Now it's, we must stop the other, we must stop the enemy. And it's tribalistic, it's in-group, it goes back to some very, very primal, very medieval, very barbaric kind of cultures that a lot of human civilization has been moving away from. But these groups, and a lot of the organizers of these groups, they're doing it quite deliberately, are tapping into some of these baser instincts in order to further their own ends.
So speaking of Andy Ngo, you've seen the video of his recent assault by Antifa. Yes. The reason why we're having this interview right now. It looks very chaotic, but I think, you know, you've been documenting that some of this stuff is extremely systematized, and there's different types of people that are involved in guiding the way the violence works and so forth. Can you explain a little bit what you saw in the video?
To kind of break down, if you watch what happens in the Andy Ngo video, and you can watch this from multiple angles. I had the opportunity to speak to Andy, you know, sort of over text while he was in the hospital, and you can understand what was done to him was a strategy, right? This was a tactic that was used against him. If you're watching the video, you know, you might think, oh, this is just chaos, everything's happening so quickly, there's no actual, you know, rhyme or reason to it, it's just people going crazy. But actually look at what happens and document what happens, right? They sort of pop out with masks, with the black bloc, everyone's in black, everyone's covered. Those people then begin to strike him. They strike him in the head specifically. They're going for the head. They're going to create head injuries. Then those people slink back into the black bloc. You can't find them, you can't track them because of their outfits, right? This is a tactic. This is something that has been predetermined. This idea of, you know, sort of incapacitate your opponent's ability to see, incapacitate them in order their ability to reason, shock them, then go in, create the attacks, go for head attacks, which they know could create lasting damage. We know that this created brain bleeding. You know, hopefully, I pray to God that everything is okay, but that could cause lasting damage, of course, to Andy or to anyone that they target with these tactics. And essentially, what Antifa does is they organize their black blocs in three levels, right? The three levels are green, yellow, and red, and it's like a pyramid. Green is the biggest, then yellow, then red. And what do I mean by that? So green level of the black bloc is, those are just sort of your hangers-on. Those are your people that'll maybe show up, hold up a sign, chant the chant. They're not there to really get their hands dirty, but what they serve is a very essential purpose for the people who do want to get their hands dirty and do want to commit this, right? So they create a cover in terms of, like, you know, think of like a school of fish, right? Can you point out one tuna in any school of tuna, right? You can't. They all look exactly the same, and that's the idea. So within that black block, you've got the greens. The yellows then, your middle block, those are your organizers. Those are the ones kind of deciding the next move. They're deciding what's going to happen next. They're deciding when to strike. They're deciding who's going to strike. And then you get to your reds. And your reds are the smallest group, but those are also going to be your most violent. So they are going to commit violence. They're going to commit destruction of property. They're going to do what Antifa refers to as direct action. And these will be separated. So in Antifa planning meetings, which I've sat in on, I've actually infiltrated Antifa groups and sat in on their planning meetings, and they'll even separate the greens and the reds in terms of the circles at the meeting. So they'll have a private meeting with the greens and then another private meeting with the reds. So the greens have a sense that there might be something going on called direct action, but it doesn't involve them. And they're told to be quiet, don't talk to media, don't talk to reporters. Whereas the reds will be told, okay, you know, this is what we're going to do, this is who we're going to hit, this is when it's going to happen. You throw the milkshake first, you throw the, you know, if you have a brick, if you have a weapon, you aim for the head. That's what the reds are all told. You smash, you know, this property is going to get it, we're going to break this window if we have the opportunity. And then they go through their sort of they have sort of calls that they'll go out for. One of them is alerta. So alerta is everyone gets quiet and then listens to the leader. Then the leader explains what's going to happen next. Or they'll do mic check. Mic check, everyone stops talking and you're about to hear instructions. So once they learn these different calls, these different behaviors, and I've tracked this across the United States. I've gone over to Europe. I've seen these same calls being used even in Europe. So
really?
We know that there's essentially TTP transfer. So when I was in the intelligence community, we would see what's called TTP transfer. That's tactics, techniques, and procedures that are then shared throughout multiple groups. The most famous one or infamous one of all time is that IRA. So the IRA bombings that would go on in the 70s, we would then see those same bombing tactics used by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, so the PLO. And so a lot of people would kind of look at that and say, well, wait, what are Irish people doing helping the Palestinian terrorists, right? It doesn't, you know, there's no connection. Sure, but there's a tactical connection. And so you'll see this TTP transfer to multiple groups in terms of one group will see something that becomes effective, and then the other group will adopt it. This has only been fueled by the rise of social media, because social media makes it easy. You don't even need to call people anymore. You can just watch on social media, see what's happening. And so milkshaking was an example of this tactic, which is something that originated in Britain. It originated in the United Kingdom. Nigel Farage was milkshaked, right? We saw tweets from even some companies, you know, fast food companies saying, hey, get your milkshakes today, whereas other ones were saying, we're not going to be providing milkshakes because there's a political rally going on and we know you're using this tactic. That tactic was very effective. And so it then migrated to the United States.
Okay.
And we see it happening in the United States as well, you know, happened in Portland. The Portland police put out a report that there was a worry that there was mixing of chemicals actually into the milkshakes. But then you see the media running cover for this by saying, oh, it's okay, it's just milkshakes. There's no problem with that. It's okay that you're resorting to violence. It's funny, this is a joke, we can all laugh about this, without understanding that, look, whether or not there's chemicals in these milkshakes, I hope to God they're not doing that, something like that, but even if they're not, they're using that as a tactic to incapacitate their opponent, to blind them, where then the Reds can strike in with tools, with implements. We saw someone with a crowbar at Portland that was bashing people in the head.
Right.
This is the purpose of the milkshakes. The purpose is to blind you so that the other people can then move in with a second wave attack and come in and commit actual, real physical injury.
So, you know, what strikes me about them, the fact that a lot of these people are masked, most of them, it creates this anonymity. It almost you know, you can commit violence with impunity because you won't be found out that you were the one that did it. I think there's about 15 states that have anti-masking laws and, you know, gatherings and so forth. I think even New York.
Right, and a lot of that actually goes back to the KKK. A lot of those are actually KKK laws because the Klan was doing this. This is also Democrats, by the way, that were coming up in, and they would, you know, create their lynch mobs. They would go after Catholics. They would go after Republicans, and obviously African Americans, freed slaves, particularly in the South, because they had the mask on, and that was the purpose of the masks. The purpose of them was obviously to incite, to strike fear. And intimidation, but also the secondary purpose was that you didn't necessarily know who it was. So when they put the mask on, it creates sort of a psychological sense of the wearer that they're invulnerable, that they're not going to be held accountable for their actions, that they're not going to be found out, all of which, of course, is certainly not true in this day and age, where I was involved in sort of a search about 2 years ago when there was a bike lock used in a Berkeley protest that turned into a riot, and an individual there had brought a bike lock that he had purchased on Amazon several days before, specifically to bash people in the head with it, and he struck one Trump supporter and split his head open. And I say we, but myself and many people on the internet, specifically a website called 4chan, dug through every single item they could find this guy wearing. So yeah, we can't see his face, but you know what? We could see his watch, we could see his shoes, we could see his backpack, right? And they then went and searched all of the other photos of the group and its organizations until they found exactly who the guy was. And his name was Eric Clanton, and he was actually a university professor, of all things, given probation for bashing someone in the head with a bike lock. So those tactics, as well as the police now is able to use cell phone data. So if these groups are organizing in a specific area to hold their planning meetings, the police can track the data of which cell phones were at that meeting, and then physically geolocate them as they move from that meeting over to the riot and back. So now you've got a group where you can at least pinpoint if it's 20 people, if it's 30 people, if it's 100 people, you can get those 100 numbers, and now you've got 100 people, which is a number that you can start to whittle down who you think it might be. This is just basic investigative process, but because the police have the ability to do that, and if they are worried about further attacks going, depending on the warranting, they can track text messages, they can track phone calls that were made during that time period, during that window frame. They can issue a warrant to Verizon, Sprint, whatever, T-Mobile, and get all that information. So for these folks who think that the masking is going to protect them, it may delay law enforcement, but it's not going to protect them completely. That said, the ordinances that are being passed and new ones that are being talked about, Portland just mentioned this, that passing new ordinances that if you are attending a political event, a political demonstration, that you cannot wear masks. I think that's absolutely going to be effective because we know, right? We know this throughout history. We know this throughout different instances of this, that once those masks come off, the violence dies down because people realize that they will be held accountable for their actions because they are not masked. And the effect it has is a chilling effect in terms of violence. And I think that's good, right? I'm all for, look, if these groups, they don't like Donald Trump, they don't like Jack Posobiec, they want to go protest, by all means, that is America and they have a First Amendment right to do so. What they don't have a right to do is throw punches, throw milkshakes, and bash people in the head with crowbars.
The Portland police have been accused of just kind of standing by while some of this violence was happening in the past, but it seems now actually this anti-masking rule that they want to pass has been, I don't know if it's been proposed, but it's certainly endorsed by the police chief, who's curiously, her name is Outlaw.
Yes.
So it seems like there's some kind of a shift if you were to believe that the police were being bystanders, and I think there's compelling evidence that was happening to some extent. You think that this video is actually what prompted that shift? What caused that?
Oh, I think so. I think we've seen police in multiple instances, not just this, but also with officer-involved shootings, that a lot of policing tactics and policies will change in response to viral video. They call it the Ferguson effect, of course, what happened in Ferguson. But it's not the same as that, but it's similar in terms of a viral video is having, because of the content of the video, is having an effect on the policing policy. And in this case, with the police putting forward an endorsement for this new idea of unmasking, essentially, which is law in many states, by the way. I think it's a fantastic idea. I think they should absolutely push that forward. Look, the police are there for public safety, and the police have limited resources. I was actually in Baltimore during the Freddie Gray riots, and I saw that the rioters were not touched. They were looting, they were burning the city, they were burning cars, they were flipping over cars. It was mass hysteria, right? The veil of civilization fell for a time. And the police were really just sort of cordoning off specific areas of the city. They weren't stopping the rioters. They weren't going after them. And the decision that was made by the mayor at the time was resoundingly criticized, and she eventually sort of stepped down as mayor. And the idea was, though, the mentality was on the police side that we don't have enough resources to stop all of them. So what is the most good we can do with the least resources that we have? Ultimately, I think that was sort of a failed idea, and they called in the National Guard, and that put a stop to things very quickly.
Right.
And obviously, we would like to not have a situation where we have to resort to military force to be able to quell these things. And so stopping them off in terms of preventative ordinances like an unmasking law would be far more sufficient.
So Jack, I came across this interesting tweet from Tim Pool, which caught my eye. I'll read it to you. I love how far the left is simultaneously saying, Andy Ngo should have known this was going to happen. That's one thing. And then saying, it's a disinformation campaign to smear Antifa as violent. So you're kind of seeing both these sorts of narratives out there. What do you make of this?
Right, so the media doesn't particularly call out violence on the left, and they don't call out Antifa. Compare that or contrast that with their response to Covington Catholic, a 14-year-old boy standing on the steps of Lincoln Memorial smiling while someone pounds a drum in his face. But because he was wearing a MAGA hat, the media attacked them, accused him of all sorts of horrible things, atrocious racist things were said about him, atrocious violence was, sort of encouraged against this child. And in the end, it was found that all he did was stand there with a smirk on his face, sort of an awkward situation. And to be honest, I felt that he had dealt with it, quite admirably given the circumstances. But when you see the left, and actually just yesterday, there was an incident where a left-wing protester went to the White House, didn't have a permit. You need this on White House and public grounds. Didn't have a permit to do this. Set an American flag on fire. Right. And when the Secret Service came over to put it out with fire extinguishers, because he didn't have a permit to do that there, which is required on public property, not illegal, right? We've got First Amendment, but you do need a permit. So the Secret Service came over to put it out, and they threw the burning flag at the Secret Service officer. And then, of course, he was arrested for felony assault after that.
Right.
But media just completely silent on this violence. The media completely overlooks it. Compare that to any situation where, a Trump supporter or someone in the right does anything the least bit untoward. If I have a spicy tweet, I get headlines across Newsweek and the Washington Post if I'm, making fun of someone on the left. But when you have actual physical violence being committed by leftists against police officers, against other conservatives, it's completely downplayed, or even in a worse situation, which I think, as Tim is explaining here, is that it's almost justified in a way. It's almost supported in a way, in this sense that, hey, we don't support violence, but, you shouldn't have done that, but.
Right.
And it's victim blaming. In a lot of these cases, it's victim blaming. Say, Andy Ngo shouldn't have gone there without security. Andy Ngo shouldn't have, showed up to a group where he'd been critical of after, he should have known what was going to happen. That's victim blaming. That's textbook victim blaming.
Which is bizarre, because this is, precisely the thing that I think would be a progressive issue. You can't blame the victims, right? The victims are always right, is kind of the
Right, exactly. So progressivism is built, the highest principle of progressivism is victimhood, right? And victim status. So victim status is sort of this inverted pyramid where instead of your accomplishments or your merits being how you're defined, instead they define people by their past oppressions or past victimization. And so that's why they sort of rack and stack to see who's become the most victimized, even if it's not you personally, but maybe your family, maybe your identity. And that's not to say that oppression and victimization hasn't happened, but the left really upholds that more than anything else. And so now we've got a group of people that have become victims of the left. So victims of violence, victims of assaults, victims of doxing. They've doxed Tucker Carlson time and time again. I was able to call attention to that, get Twitter to ban the accounts that were doing it. They've attacked Tucker's house. They've gone after his wife, just hiding in the cupboard, calling 911. And still, the media will play these games of saying, well, Antifa's got some bad members, just like any group, but the goals they stand for are altruistic and morally justified. And it's quite ridiculous to hear them try to say these things. So I actually welcome them when they do it because it just kind of destroys their credibility, and it really lays naked and bare their absolute skewed bias in this situation. And so you've got a problem where instead of denouncing violence, they end up kind of encouraging more of it because they're not denouncing it and because they're told that it's going to be okay. Or, in even a worse situation, they'll sort of build up the person who was committing the violence. There was a guy in 2016 who rushed the stage at a Trump rally, screaming that he was going to get Trump, and CNN gave him an interview. Right? CNN interviewed this guy who knows what he would have done, would throw a punch, whatever, arrested by Secret Service. But CNN gave that guy an interview, and they gave him a platform. What message does that send to everybody else then? That if you commit violence, that if you are anti-Trump, because Trump is, and Trump supporters therefore are the out group and we're the in group, that the in group will elevate you, that the in group will give you a platform, the in group will popularize you and support you and platform you, whereas the out group, anything that happens to them because they're the out group, that's okay. That doesn't matter. I mean, it's like, you're talking about internecine warfare between Greek city-states, right? It doesn't matter what happens to them. Those are the Athenians. You can do whatever you want to an Athenian. Instead of living in, a constitutional republic like we're living in, it's almost like the rules are devolving into a much more primitive, tribalistic state. And to see this continue to be upheld, this sort of new formation, this new subversion of American politics, of American civil liberties, it's truly dangerous.
So, and this is precisely what the left will accuse the right of. Hey, look, there's alt-right. I think you've been accused of being alt-right. I don't even fully understand what that.
Well, the left says that everyone that they don't like is a Nazi. So the left immediately in their mind, if they disagree with you on a certain policy or they think that you're not on our side, they think that everyone to the left of everyone to the right of Joseph Stalin is a Nazi. So Tucker Carlson's a Nazi, Trump's a Nazi, I'm a Nazi, you're probably a Nazi, everyone's a Nazi, right? Even Andy Ngo, who's a gay Asian, he's a Nazi. Everyone becomes a Nazi, which is interesting because for a few years we were all Russian agents, but now we've been converted back to Nazis because the whole Russian thing didn't fall apart. And the reason for the labelization is quite simple. It provides them an emotional cheat and an intellectual sort of out. Instead of having to confront someone on what they have said, instead of having to confront someone on their actual policy positions or the actual opinions and statements that they make, you can just label them and then write them off. And it's also, in a sense, it's not just group fence behavior or grouping behavior of in-group and out-group, which is something that we, by the way, see in terms of a lot of cults are like this. A lot of these sort of cult groups will have their own in-group mentality, and that the rest of the world is against them, right? And so we see this on the left quite frequently now, and the ability to throw a label on someone, it creates an intellectual cheat where instead of having to deal with the things that they've said or deal with them as a human, you can dehumanize them under that label. So you're dehumanizing them by saying, oh, they're a Nazi, even if they completely oppose the Nazis. I myself, I'm Polish, right? You know, the idea of anybody, and as you know, the idea of a Polish supporting the Nazis is ridiculous. It's ludicrous. It's completely ignorant of history and ignorant of truth. But it doesn't matter to them, right? Because they don't care, and they're using it in order to dehumanize their opponents, and they want to dehumanize their opponents so that they can justify any action that they take against them.
So that actually makes me think of, you know, the Russiagate shooting, where basically, you know, there's this guy, you know, believed this reality and ended up, you know, basically shooting these, you know, Republican congressional members. Wow.
Yeah, you had a guy, James T. Hodgkinson, a little bit older than you would normally expect for a domestic terrorist, you know, baby boom generation, drives across half the country, sells his business, gets out of his house, leaves his wife, drives across half the country to Alexandria, Virginia, checks into a YMCA of all places, and stakes out this, I mean, this was very well planned out, stakes out a baseball field for a month and is waiting, is checking all the vantage points, and eventually he shows up when a group of Republican congressmen, senators, Steve Scalise, Rand Paul, Jeff Flake, were all there. He went in and shot it up with an SKS, which is a version of a AK-47 rifle, and almost killed Steve Scalise. And one of the last things that he posted on his Facebook, he was eventually killed by police, and thank God that the Capitol Police were there, because Steve Scalise was the House Majority Leader at the time, and so he warranted Capitol Police 24/7. Had he not had that Capitol Police 24/7 coverage, they may not have been able to take down the shooter, the Russiagate shooter, and he would have had to wait for local police to come, so he would have had almost a free hand in attacking that ball field without them. And so the last thing he posts on his Facebook page is that the Republicans are traitors to the country, and he posts up this pledge, you know, sign the pledge to get rid of the Russian traitors in the Republican Party. And so he had become so twisted and so warped by this reality that was fanned and promulgated by mainstream sources, MSNBC, New York Times, Washington Post, that he decided to, you know, proverbially take matters into his own hands and commit possibly the most heinous form of leftist violence that we've seen, in actually using a rifle to take shots at Republican congressmen because he believed that they were traitors.
So, you know, you're the author of 4D Warfare, right? And you're thinking about how to, you know, basically help influence people's thinking in different ways. This is a part of your work. It's kind of like, speaking of Scott Adams, kind of like what he says, the country is watching the world through these 2 or more different screens, you know, filter for how they see it. What is your prescription for helping people see the other side?
The biggest thing is to stop the dehumanization. The biggest thing is to stop the dehumanization of the other side, but also the acceptance of violence, of showing people that there will be consequences for your actions, that violence will not be tolerated. And I'm actually quite critical of the justice system in a few of these cases, because some of these assaults, including the bike lock, they were given probation. They weren't even given jail time. Actually, the guy who assaulted me in Washington, he was put behind bars, because actually he initially had probation, but then he broke his probation, and so he was put in jail. And we have to make an example of the fact that political violence cannot be tolerated, because if we as a country, if we as a system send the message that political violence might be okay, then you're going to create an extremely toxic situation. You're going to create a downward cycle of violence that will not end well, full stop. And so in order to do that, is you need to set these boundaries. These are boundaries done by law. You know, there's actually something that happened very recently, which I think is fantastic. But it also made me think in a way. So have you heard of the ice cream challenge? Have you heard of this viral thing called the ice cream challenge? Yes. And this is where a lot of Zoomers are doing it, Generation Z. You go into a store, you open an ice cream container, you lick it, you close the top, you put it back on. Well,
20 years potentially.
In Texas, it turns out that's a felony. And you can face up to 20 years in jail. And of course, these are kids that are filming themselves doing it, as part of the challenge. It's like, hey guys, let's go commit crimes on camera and then show everyone that we did it. So it's like a Darwin challenge a little bit as well. But the reason that it's a felony is because tampering consumer goods is a felony. And I said, my goodness, imagine if we treated political violence as strongly as we treated consumer goods, right? And I thought, no, I think that's good for the ice cream, and I think that will have a chill, and it's going to absolutely have a chilling effect, and it's going no pun intended, of stopping this viral challenge. So why don't we make it a felony to commit political violence? Why don't we make it a hate crime? Put that modifier on there for people's political persuasion, for people's political ideology. Political ideology should be a protected class in the United States. You should not be able to discriminate because of someone's political ideology, whether that be in social media, whether it be an organization, whether it be university, academia, etc., company, military. You should not be able to discriminate. That's number one. And then number two is, if someone is attacked for their politics, it should be a felony.
It's a great place to end. Jack, wonderful to have you.
Thanks so much, John.